Thank you for joining us. I'm Anyo from the Community Independence Project and also work with Dr. Sophie Scamps here in Mackellar. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Federal Member for Mackellar Sophie Scamps and Kylea Tink, Federal Member for North Sydney. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Anyo.
Thank you.
Before we get stuck into deliberative democracy, I just thought we should acknowledge the incredible work that Kylea, her team, and her volunteers have done representing the electorate of North Sydney, and the devastating news about the draft boundary redistributions in New South Wales.
Yeah, look, I think it's fair to say last Friday was pretty traumatic for a lot of people, not the least myself. I think you can be prepared for something. You think you're prepared for the possibility, but then when you hear it, your reaction is quite different. But I think what's really important to know is, number one, it's a draft proposal. So there is no doubt that the community of North Sydney is going to mobilise and lodge our objections to it and to try and make a case for why we actually believe. The irony is, as a community, we've never been stronger. So the AEC talks about, seats being defined by being a community of interest. Well, the truth of the matter is in 2022, North Sydney stood up for really only the second time in its life and said, we are more than a community of interest. We're a community prepared to take our voice and our vote back. So we will be objecting to the finding. But I think what's really important, at the end of the day, the North Sydney community is not going anywhere. We're very much welded on to the movement that is community independence because we actually fundamentally believe in the importance of all of us accepting responsibility for our own democratic rights and making sure that if we're not happy with it, we're having our voice heard. So I think, I said to you beforehand, if North Sydney proceeds to be redistributed across 3 other seats, I think that's really bad news for the major parties because at the moment they've got one community focused in one place. If they divide us, we're splitting across 3 seats. And I know we already have one of those seats that are independent, but I can pretty much say we will take the other 2 as well.
Woo! I love it. Bring it on.
Yeah.
So, thank you for that, Kylea. So, of course, this is the People-Powered Politics Convention. So we're here to talk about deliberative democracy and citizens' assemblies. I might start with you, Sophie. For people who don't know what that is, would you be able to give us a bit of background? What is this model and how's it been used overseas, like in Ireland for the abortion debate and things like that?
Sure. So one of the things that we noticed before the last election is that people were feeling disenfranchised. They were feeling cut out and shut out of their democracy, that they only had one opportunity to be involved in their democracy, is that was when they voted, and then you hand over the reins. So deliberative democracy is all about trying to bring people back into their democracy. And as Cathy McGowan says, our democracy is not a spectator sport. And I always say we need the participation of our people to keep our democracy strong. So this is a way of bringing people back in to hand over some of that decision-making power to people. And there's some really important components of it. The first one is it has to be a representative sample. So that means randomisation. So when we did ours, we sent out 5,000 invitations randomly to people to invite them to be a part of our jury. But also it's really important that the sample is representative of the larger population. So with a small group like ours, we only had 30 people, but we also had to do a little bit of stratification to make sure it was truly representative. And then the next part of it is deliberation. People need time and they need access to information, and they need that time to sit together, have those conversations, to listen to one another, to debate the ideas and to come up with respectful answers. And it's extremely powerful. And it is something that's really regaining traction. It's been around forever. It's been around since, Athens first created democracy. So it's been around for a long, long while, but it's regaining favour in a lot of democracies around the world, particularly in Europe. And it can be used at any level of government. So it can be used at the local level, at the regional level, at the national level, and even at the transnational level. So the EU has been using it. They have a group, and it's all about what direction should the EU, with their member states, what direction should they be using? But a good example is what's happened in Ireland. They had a citizens' assembly that deliberated on 5 really key areas for them. They included they're really complex, ideas or complex problems, issues. And one was climate change, and another one for Ireland was whether to make abortion legalised, because in their constitution it was illegal. And so they had these citizens' assembly to deliberate on those, and the outcomes of that was Ireland declared a climate emergency, and they had a referendum on the abortion, which ended up passing, so that abortion is now legal in Ireland. So really critical, complex issues can be debated in a really kind of respectful and positive way.
And it sort of takes me back. For me, in Mackellar, it's kind of the next step or the next stage up from the kitchen table conversation model that we used when, as a community group, several years back. A couple of people on the convention last night were asking what is a kitchen table, and so could you sort of give a little bit of background to how that process worked as well and how that involved the community?
Well, again, I think you and I and many others in Mackellar were feeling shut out and not truly, genuinely represented. So we thought, well, we'd heard about Kathy again and Indi and the kitchen table model. So we thought, right, if you want to be truly represented, genuinely represented, then you have to start with listening. You don't start with saying this is what you need to believe. You start with listening. And I just think it's so fabulous, this idea of kitchen table conversations where you just sit down with people and you just ask questions. You don't really speak, you're just listening. But it's this really respectful opportunity for people to both have their say but also listen to one another. And it says conversations. It's not so much a conversation as to listening to one another, which I think is a really powerful thing. A lot of the time we don't listen to one another anymore. We go into our echo chamber and we only hear what we want to hear. So it's a really important way to open up that conversation in many ways. And what we found is it was so powerful. People were exhilarated. They absolutely loved it. I mean, people are a bit hesitant to start with when you think we're talking about politics, but when you sort of break it down to actually, we're not talking politics, well, yes, we are, but we're talking about what is important to you. We want to hear from you what's important to you. When you give people that opportunity, they find it extremely exhilarating. And I think we were blown away time and again about how empowered and how invigorated people felt just being listened to for once.
Absolutely.
Can I just segue?
Yeah.
I'm going to say what's really interesting is actually, arguably in North Sydney, I was found through a kitchen table conversation. So somebody who knew me had gone to a kitchen conversation in somebody else's room.
Story.
And ended up the next morning calling me saying, I went to this thing last night. We had this conversation and I think I need to put your name forward. So there are multiple benefits to kitchen table conversation.
That's fantastic. Yes, that's excellent. Thank you for sharing that.
And I should say as well, there's slightly different models on kitchen tables as well. So ours was purely, we wanted to hear from people and we wanted to give a report to the candidates in the lead up to the next election. So all a little bit different.
And so moving on to back to deliberative democracy, Kylea, could you tell us a bit about how you use this model in North Sydney?
Yeah, so actually I think we were the first federal electorate in this term to actually take the deliberative democracy model and bring it into our electorate. So we had a deliberative democracy forum last October looking at housing affordability and availability. And we actually worked with the organisation New Democracy, who I cannot speak highly enough of. I know actually.
Big shout out to New Democracy.
Big shout out to New Democracy, because actually I know they're also one of the organisations that had done the work in Ireland, for example. So they've done work internationally as well. So for us, I think the real challenge in taking a seat from a major political party is in finding a way that you can then open a conversation which becomes about a community representative being truly dedicated to representing all people, regardless of how they voted at the polls. And so for us, that first deliberative democracy event was a chance for me to say, I don't care how you voted, but I do care what you think about the housing affordability and availability crisis. And that's what this deliberative democracy forum is going to help us see. So a bit like Sophie just explained, we sent 5,000 invitations out randomly across the seat. I don't know how you guys found it, but actually what I found fascinating is we had a couple of community pop-ups during the time that the invitations had gone out. And people would come up to me and say, hey, I got this thing in the post from you and I just think it's junk mail. I'm going to bin it. And I was like, don't. You are one of 5,000 people. Like it's a golden ticket, you know.
It is.
And in fact, ironically, one of the women that I had exactly that conversation with in Lane Cove went home, got the invitation out of her bin, registered. So the system is that those who wish to participate register, and then you work with your team, as Sophie said, to identify a randomised but statistically representative sample of your electorate. Now, that woman ended up being one of the women in the room on the day.
Fantastic.
I've got to say that the other thing that really stood out to me is the fact that as the member, I had no input into the policy discussion that day. So basically what happens then is the 30 demographically representative people come together. They get the opportunity to hear from experts in the field. So different ideas are put down in front of them. They review submissions that may have been received from the community. So it really is, what do you think? How can we progress this? And then I come in, I said, thank you for coming. And then I left them alone for, 8 hours in the course of the day, to come back at the end of the day to actually give them the opportunity, which is, Kylea, we've discussed it, we've debated it, we've thought it through, and this is, we want you to advocate for this. Now, the irony in our case is what North Sydney came up with was prioritising the development of medium density housing around major commuter hubs. That's really important in North Sydney because we have a number of new metro stations that have opened or are opening in the next 3 to 5 years. And again, the irony was, I don't know if the New South Wales Liberal Party got an advance copy of our report, but within 2 weeks, New South Wales Labor, the government, actually announced that they would be prioritising medium density builds around major commuter hubs. So it's incredibly powerful. And there were people in that room who didn't vote for me, who were part of that conversation, and even those people left at the end of the day going, I actually really respect that you made time to listen to me and my opinions. So it is a way of bringing communities together around their opportunity that is stepping into your democratic rights without having to be tribalised about it. And I think that overcoming tribal barriers is a significant benefit in it.
And so we talk here at the Community Independence Project about the two-way compact between the community and a community independent MP. So how has doing this process informed your sort of approach with your community, not just on housing, but more generally?
Oh, yeah, look, I'm sure Sophie's the same. I think every community independent's the same. There is no me without we. I've said that from the day I was elected, from the day I said I would run. And even now, with the challenge that we face, I recently had a conversation with a whole group of people from across the North Sydney electorate where I basically said, if you want North Sydney to say, you have to fight for it. It's not up to me to fight for it. So we are in this together. And I think it is the beauty of the new democracy model is it really does bring us back to the reality. Nowhere in our constitution does the word party exist. It's not there. It's not written in. Somehow we've gotten our country to the point where we are gridlocked around two major parties who think they know what's best for us. The entire opportunity that is the community independent movement is the opportunity that says we're going to take what the Constitution says we have, which is a right for representation, and then we're going to work with the person that we send to represent us to make sure that person is representing us in a way which is aligned to our ambitions, our ideals, our sense of optimism and hope for the country. And as a community independent, unless you've got mechanisms like that, you can't know what you're fighting for, because I didn't run because I thought I had all the answers. I'm not still there because I think I have all the answers. I ran and I'm there because I fundamentally believe in the capacity of my community to have the answers for themselves. And that's the beauty of actually being a community independent, I think, is you get to put your faith in other people right at the front of your life and at your advocacy at the federal level.
Absolutely. I think that's something we noticed in Mackellar in the housing jury that we did, is that people come so constructive, and we really need to put more faith in everyday people.
Yeah.
Do you want to share a little bit of anything else about the Mackellar housing jury?
Yes, no, I 100% agree with Kylea. It's such a powerful way to, I think, rebuild trust in our political system and in us as representatives. It's extremely powerful, and it really legitimizes what we are taking to Canberra, because you can say, well, I've actually done everything I can to listen as, effectively as I can to our community. And so it legitimizes what you do. And I think also what you talked about with tribalism, it breaks that down. We're in a more, our political sphere is becoming more and more polarized, and what we need to do is start bringing people together on constructive, finding constructive solutions rather than falling back to the party ideology. What we actually do, we have major challenges ahead of us, and we need to be listening to the people so that we can come up with constructive solutions. And I would say it was wonderful to see people at the end of the day, and I don't know of you, but people were really, again, invigorated. They felt so excited to have been a part of this really constructive process, regardless of whether they had voted for me or not. Again, we're extremely thankful to be given the opportunity to be listened to in a really constructive way. And I think it is a really powerful way to keep strengthening our democracy. People, we do need to trust our people, and that's who we're representative. So it's a really powerful way to listen.
You know what strikes me, Anya, as Sophie just talks is, I'm sure both of the major parties would argue that they do this because they have a membership base.
Yep.
So the Labor Party would say that their ideas that they debate come up through their caucus. I'm sure the Liberal and National Party would say exactly the same thing. But let's be really clear. Less than 4% of Australians belong to a political party. I just want to repeat that. Less than 4% of Australians
That's a pretty
belong to a
small
political
echo
party.
chamber of ideas.
Correct. So deliberative democracy and community independent politics is an opportunity to invite the other 96% into it. And the beauty of it is, unlike the major parties, we're not exclusive. So the 4% that currently are part of the Liberal and Labor bubbles are actually still invited into ours.
Exactly.
So I think that is the power. And it's been interesting to watch the major parties respond to that, because it's almost like that emoji with the mind blow where they kind of go, you can't do that. Oh my God, they're doing it.
Yes.
Well, that's the thing.
That's it.
Kylie, is that we were hoping, the crossbench was hoping, the community independents were hoping that we would do this at a national level. We made that proposal to the government. But
On housing.
Yeah, on housing. It wasn't taken up, which is why we've been doing it in our own electorates. But I think, again, it's really powerful because it's all about bringing new ideas, different ideas, and that's what independents can do as well, is bring fresh ideas to the Parliament, which may have either fallen off the table or not be politically expedient.
Now, you're both 2 years into a 3-year term, and I know everybody out there, we've got so much to talk about. We've only got another few minutes if there are any questions from the audience that we want to take as well. But I think people would love to hear what life is really like inside Parliament House for a community independent question time and things like that. So do you have anything you can share with us?
Kylie and I are neighbours. and Zoe. It's good, isn't it? Like, it's crazy. I mean, I think you have to say it's pretty hectic, isn't it? With these bells going off and there's speaking, you've got to keep an eye on what's happening with the speaking opportunities. We're meeting all the time with different groups, meeting with each other, meeting with the ministers. There's a lot going on, isn't there? And
I think every day in Parliament, the truth is every day in Parliament feels like 3.
Yeah.
You sort of have your morning session, your middle session and your afternoon session. I think the job itself, it is, when you do it this way, it's 24/7 because being part of the community means you can't actually go out to buy groceries without somebody wanting to talk to you about the cost of them as you pick them up. But I think that ultimately what I would say is the most satisfying part of it is the impact we've been able to have. There was a lot of preamble in the last election about how people like us would cause chaos in the House, that we'd be sources of division, we'd be the sources of crisis. But to be honest, that's not been our role at all. And in fact, everything from the climate bills through to the administrative review tribunals, through to the water trigger, through to fuel efficiency standards, and now more increasingly from my point on human rights side, we are getting somewhere. And again, what's really important is that people understand that's not because we're getting somewhere, it's because our communities are getting somewhere. And I think for me, there's a real highlight in the HEX piece. For me in North Sydney, a mum called Kate Muir came to me and said, do you understand how HEX is currently indexed in the system? And she explained it to me and I kind of went, that doesn't make sense. And she said, yeah, it doesn't make sense. So I went to Canberra, I met with Jason Clare and said, do you realise this is how it's indexed? And he kind of went, oh, I don't have time to deal with that. So then I stood up in question time and said, do you realise this is how it's indexed? And he was put on the spot.
Wow.
And then we see, Ryan did her stuff, you guys have been doing your stuff, and then 12 months later, the government comes out and says, oh, indexation is broken and we're going to fix it. Now, it would be very easy for me to go, yay, isn't that great? Look at what I did. But it wasn't me. It was Kate Muir and her son that made that happen. And that's the satisfaction that I think you get out of things like deliberative democracy forums, out of having a really engaged community and people who are prepared. I always say to people, if somebody looks at you and is complaining about something in our federal government space, don't argue with them. Simply look at them and go, well, what are you going to do about it?
Yep.
Because the opportunity is there for all of us to do something about it.
And I'll add to that, it's extremely powerful, isn't it, when you have people that come to you with an issue and you've never heard of it before and you go, Wow, that is something that needs to be addressed. Okay, let's deal with that.
Yeah.
And the great thing about being a community independent is you're not hamstrung by what the party line is, what the agenda is. You can actually bring it to Parliament and you open up this conversation and you get media attention to it and you build a conversation around it. So it's a really powerful way to bring in fresh ideas and address issues that need to be addressed.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. We're hoping to do a question from the audience. So we have one that says, to what extent is the success of the independent movement and deliberative democracy a feature of education and thoughtful people who get their information from reliable sources and not Facebook?
Well, that's a big question. I guess I might answer first and then I'll let Soph, because my response to that actually is that the process of deliberative democracy actually overcomes the lack of education. So I often say to people, I don't think our democracy is as healthy as all of us would like to believe it is. The truth is there are a few very powerful organisations in our country at the moment that have a disproportionate say in how our country moves forward and how democracy operates. So I guess my response to that questioner would be, deliberative democracy works because you don't have to be educated. You simply have to receive an invitation in the mail and be curious enough to want to be part of that conversation. So in some ways, it's a way of short-circuiting and making up for what is clearly a gap in civics education in our country.
That's exactly right. Facebook and social media means that we're in our own echo chambers as well. So we only listen to one another. That's why the kitchen table conversations is so powerful, because you're sitting there and you have to listen to one another and hear views that you may never have heard previously. So it is extremely powerful. But I think when we did our kitchen table conversations, it was quite amazing because it didn't matter what people's backgrounds were. People came up with the same issues that were important to them. So I think that's why we need to be doing more and more of this type of thing, just simply listening, simply having conversations, having kitchen conversations, having deliberative democracy, because it reduces that polarization. It opens up your world. It opens up your mind. You realize that there are people with different perspectives to yours and you learn. And it can be done in a really respectful, non-antagonistic way, non-confrontational way.
Yep.
Respect is so important. And that's why when we say we say to people, we try and encourage people to have those gentle conversations with people around them, with your friends, with your family, because they may have never heard your opinion before. But if you say, actually, no, that's really important to me for this reason, they'll go, oh, I didn't know that. But it opens people's eyes. Yeah.
I think the other thing it does is it really, when you strip it back and you give people space, the truth of the matter is there's far more that unites us than divides us. So it really is the outliers that drive that division. And unfortunately, the outliers have a greater share of media at the moment, almost in both directions. So I think creating space to come back and recognising that it's actually the uneducated, in inverted commas, I don't say that with disrespect, but the unengaged, the civics motivated individuals, they're the ones that this movement is the opportunity for. We are not the political elite. We are actually the grassroots.
Yeah, the grassroots.
It's grassroots, time and time again.
And it is about bringing people back to the centre and having conversations and talking again. I think that's it's the antidote to polarisation. We see what that happening around the world, getting increasingly polarised politics. This community movement is about bringing things back to the centre and being more respectful with one another and having conversations, genuine conversations. Yeah.
Absolutely. And talking about that polarisation, back to the major parties, what are you seeing in the House? We're almost running out of time now, but what are you seeing in the House from the major parties at the moment as we get into an election year? And what are your sort of visions for, what are your plans for the next 6 months? To election, we've got about a minute left. I'm going to have to do it in a nutshell.
In 20 seconds or less, the truth of the matter is the major parties are no longer running this country. They're running for election. And if you ran a business, there is no other business in the world where 2 years into a 3 years business cycle, you'd stop focusing on your end goals. So I think we are absolutely seeing it. The Labor Party is announcing policy priorities now that they're saying won't come into effect until July 2025. Payment on parental superannuation is a classic example of that. Meanwhile, we now see the Liberal Party shaping up around these impossible ideas that actually probably there is a fair conversation to be had there, but they're not framing it in a way for it to be had. The final thing I would say is perhaps the most fascinating thing is to watch the way that the major party candidates are repositioning themselves on a brand basis. So, Paul Fletcher, who is the current sitting incumbent in Bradfield, he no longer carries the Liberal Party logo on his communications, and he's doing community pop-ups. That's what he's talking about.
We have similar things
having
happening
an influence, guys, having an influence. Yeah.
Now, we could talk all day. It's been fantastic. In conclusion, I'd like to wrap up by thanking you and your volunteers and your teams in your communities for everything they do for our democracy and acknowledge all of that hard work. Absolutely. We're going to throw to the next session now. So thank you so much.
Thanks to our teams. Thanks to everyone out there. Yeah.
Go get them.
Bye. We've got
more time.
Can I just say
we have plenty more to talk about.
Right. So I've got one thing to say to anybody who's watching today and really at the cusp of establishing your movement. From my perspective, the most important thing you can be is inclusive. And I know Cathy McGowan was incredibly influential in North Sydney when we started our momentum, because her advice to us was, when you find yourself talking on a street with someone, don't argue with them, listen to them, as Sophie said before, because the more conversations you have where you can listen, the greater your chances are of inviting people into the conversation you want to have on an ongoing basis. And this is a numbers game, guys. You have to be growing constantly. So by the time we hit the polls, I think we had close to 1,400 people volunteering on booze and stuff. And that was only because people spoke to people who spoke to people who, brought them in. So, do not lose yourself in your own echo chamber and stay 100% committed to continuing constantly just going out of yourselves to bring people in.
And not being fearful of people questioning you.
Yeah.
And I think, again, that's the power of listening, is that it legitimizes what you take to Canberra. Because if somebody questions what you're doing, you say, well, I've done this listening. This is what my community wants and expects. This is the values of my community. It's really important. But it is really important as well just to say thanks to, because this isn't about you and me, and there's no way we would be here except for the amazing people that are behind the scenes. And again, hundreds and hundreds of people that knew that there was a better way of doing politics. And just going back to what Cathy always says, Cathy McGowan, if not you, then who? Somebody's got to step up, and it's got to be you. And that was one of the big lessons we learned, I think, is that each of us have to take responsibility for strengthening our democracy and doing this. If you're not happy with your democracy, then it's up to you to do something about it. Get involved. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think we've had a question from the audience about 4-year terms.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. I don't think that I used to think that way, but now I definitely do, because it takes 6 months or so for a government, particularly a new government, to get settled in, 18 months of trying to get stuff done, and then probably a year, left over where they're focusing on the next election. So they've really got 18 months to get work done. And I feel like 2 years has flown by, and I feel like we're just getting started. There's so many things that we've been working on and really want to keep going on. 4-year terms would be what I would suggest.
I had a very dear friend, Dennis O'Brien, who was really central to the campaign when we were running. And unfortunately, we lost Dennis in the first year of the campaign. And one of his last kind of conversations that he had with me was, if you do one thing to fix it, Kylea, get those 4-year terms in. So I think that is probably the other thing we should stop and reflect on. In the community independent movement, every minute counts. And it's why, even with the news that we've heard in North Sydney on Friday, it's devastating, but it's not the end of us. We still have 12 months to run. And in fact, this is not a flash in the pan, despite what the major parties might like to think. I believe we are going to see growth in the crossbench in the next decade. And for that to be sustainable, we have to continue to make sure that we're engaging people and, keeping people on board. So, it's a long term. This is a long-term strategy. It may be that some communities on this call today will run this time and bring their seat to marginal. That's a win. And just by deciding to run, again, quoting Cathy McGowan, anybody think we've got a girl crush? Yeah. We probably do. One of the most important things Cathy McGowan once said to me is that once you decide to step into this movement, you have to know that you have won.
Yeah.
Simply by making a decision to step in, because every day you turn up, you win. It's actually not about the outcome on election day.
Yeah. And the one thing I would agree with and just say about the 4-year terms is that one of the major problems that we keep hearing, and this came up time and time again in our kitchen table conversations, was the short-termism.
Yeah,
And what
yeah.
people want is vision. They want leadership in many ways, and they want long-term vision. And so I think, look, four-year terms may help somewhat, but at the moment it's just such a cycle, and you can see it's happened already. It's flipped already to this very divisive, trying to make the major parties trying to be distinctive from one another, and it gets very adversarial very quickly.
And that is something that we were going to talk about, which is your vision for the future of politics. Very broad question there, but also your sort of plans for the next 6 to 12 months. There could be an election as early as December this year or as late as May next year. So it's really important for everybody out there on this call. This is the time. If you're going to get active, now's the time to do it. But what are you planning in your electorates for the next sort of 6 to 12 months? And what can we look out for?
Yeah, more of the same, really. And that's continue listening, continue doing what we were kind of heard from prior to the last election, continue trying to push things through. As we know, our national environment laws are being reformed or amended at the moment, but there's a lot we need to do. So working really hard on that. That will be something that flows through to the next election as well. But that is a huge piece of work. The other thing is, we can see this growing intergenerational inequality. It's something, and things have changed somewhat. Cost of living, housing are now major issues. So it's responding to those as well, which is why we did the housing citizens assembly. So working on that, trying to get new ideas that have been debated on the table and not just going into caretaker mode. We will continue working and fighting for all the things that our community wants us to, right up to the election day. And I think that's really important. But the intergenerational inequality, that's something that I'm going to be looking at, and following other models of what's happened in other countries where they have a commissioner for the wellbeing of future generations and things like that.
So from the North Sydney side,
Yep.
we've actually recently added somebody to our team, Connor, and Connor's job is to roll out a series of deliberative democracy forums. So we're aiming to do at least 3 through in the next sort of 9 to 12 months. And those forums will focus on issues including things like early childhood education and care. What does my community want to see happen there? We've already done the housing affordability and available one. We're going to do something around women's economic empowerment and equality across the board. And then we're tossing up intergenerational equity or tax reform. So there's a lot more conversations to come in North Sydney. And I mean, I guess, you know, I'm super excited. I know you guys had your deliberative democracy event last Saturday. I understand one of the things that you guys, potentially without spoiling the punchline, your community came out with a recommendation around the establishment of a consumer advocacy group, was it? So Monday this week, David Pocock and I are actually tabling a private members bill, which will establishing a housing and homelessness advocate and actually takes housing out of a framework where it's a commodity and brings it back into a framework where it's human rights. So Kate Cheney talks about nudging the system. And I think my observation is we are most effective when we prove to the major parties that there is actually social license for them to move in a direction that we're nudging
Opening
on.
the doors.
Yeah, so there's a fair bit of nudging to still happen in the next 11 months.
Yeah.
Excellent.
And setting the agenda for the next election, I think, as well. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. And I really feel that independents have that opportunity to talk about some of those big issues that the major parties just won't even discuss, especially around tax. And
100%. And who cares? I think we're quite pragmatic too in terms of, honestly, we don't care who gets the credit for it. I think a great example was the lifting of the single parents allowance back up to the youngest child being 14. Do not be fooled. That was a push that came from the crossbench. We held the round tables. We did the work. We proved that social licence was there. And then in the lead up to the budget last year, suddenly Labor goes, we've had this great idea. I remember reading there's somebody that there's a very famous quote, which is you get more done when you don't care who gets the credit for it.
Yeah.
And I think that sums us up in a nutshell.
And a really powerful example of exactly that was the National Anti-Corruption Commission. So you had Helen Haynes and many others pushing on that for years, made it such a huge issue prior to the last election. Of course, they didn't take her private member's bill or her model, but they modelled it very closely on that and then took the win. But that's the thing. Everyone knows that there's been this really big discussion around that. It's been pushing it until it became absolutely fundamental to something they had to pass.
Mm.
And some of the big issues that at the crossbench we're also raising, which is coming up in the chat, is things like donation reform. And maybe we can also talk about, you've achieved so much in such a short period of time compared to most backbenchers, particularly from the parties, with very limited staff.
Yes.
How much time have we got, Anya?
We've got another few minutes.
Okay, just so we know to...
Yes.
Yeah, so talking about like the integrity measures, because integrity was a really key core value of what community independence stood for at the last election and still do stand for, but there's so many different facets of that. So I think the way that it's naturally fallen out, people like to know how we work together, but quite often it just falls out naturally. We've all got a key interest in integrity, but because there's so many parts to it, we've all kind of taken on different bits and pieces. So I've taken on ending jobs for mates. Zali has the ending truth and political advertising. Kate Cheney's been really working on donation reform and electoral reform, all those types of things. And
parliamentary behaviour.
Yeah, parliamentary behaviour. Mon's been looking at lobbying. So much going on. And Helen Haynes, of course, has been looking at grants and the pork barrelling. So there's and everyone's been doing so much in this space, but that's I think that's interesting for people to hear that. How does it fall out? Like there's one issue, but we can all work on it in different ways and keep nudging in different ways and continually, like it comes up at every single time there's new legislation that comes in. We keep going back to it. We go back to it. And that's what happened in the end when it came to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, which was abolished. And the new body is being established, the Administrative Review Tribunal. But because we keep pushing on this, the new body was going to be established with the same flaws that the old one was set up, with no independent selection panel. So we were able to get that through. So that was a huge win. It's not splashed across the newspapers, but it's a really fundamental change for our democracy, that now this key body that underpins our democracy now has independent selection panels mandated and legislated. It's incredible. And all of us work towards that and push towards that all the time.
And I think you asked the question about how do we get it done with so few people.
Yes.
And I think it is worth, remembering.
Yeah.
So members of the crossbench had 2 more staff than we've had for this entire term. And our teams work incredibly hard. So there's been just over 230 pieces of legislation introduced to the House in the last 2 years. And I can say, hand on heart, that I think every single piece of legislation has been read by at least one of us on the crossbench in our teams been really thoroughly scrutinised.
Yeah.
That's what we've brought to this parliament that has been absent for a really long time, because it's really important that people understand that those that are on the side of the government trust what their ministers tell them they are doing and they are led by their cabinet, and those on the opposition side of parliament follow what their shadow ministers tell them to do. So it sounds almost illogical, but frequently it is only the members of the backbench, crossbench, who will walk into the chamber knowing exactly what we're voting on when a vote is called. Yeah. And that's because our community will have scrambled to review legislation when it's first, sent out in draft form. Our teams will have scrambled to make sure they've gotten everything we need to know. And when those bells go off, they're getting whatever's being brought in. They're sending it to us on our phones. Most of the major party members are not even, they're looking at their buzzers, and their buzzers say yes or no. Vote with the government, vote against the
I
government.
think that's something a lot of people don't know.
Yeah.
They collect those buzzers as they walk into the chamber.
Not even in the chamber. They get it when they come in the morning.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they literally carry them 24/7. So it literally is the case that scrutiny of legislation has been brought back into the Australian Parliament because of the crossbench. The other thing that's really exploded, and I found this, bill has 3 stages. So there's the introduction, there's a second reading, and then there's a third reading, which is the consideration in detail. Up until the 47th Parliament, bills were basically introduced and they just went straight through. These days, the second reading debate is now had with quite a voracious appetite, but more importantly, the third reading, the consideration in detail, I know the Labor government really almost, they have this elliptical reaction. They don't want us to do it, but we are constantly challenging them with amendments and ways to make the legislation stronger.
And I can just imagine everybody out there listening to us absolutely cheering and celebrating, hearing how much you bring to improve our democracy. And we're all here to talk about people-powered democracy. So thank you for your time. And we really implore everybody who's on the Zoom today to get active.
Yep.
Participate. As Kathy says, it's not a spectator sport, and Sophie said today. So we encourage everyone to stay online, go to all of the different sessions we have today, learn to do the sort of stuff that led to what Kylea and Sophie are doing in Parliament by building up your community and running your own campaigns. We're throwing to the next session now, so thank you for your time.
Thank you,
Thank
Anu.
you. Thanks,
Thank you.
Anu.
Thanks, team.